Yes. Okay. Okay. So we're here to talk about sort of life in the past, life not necessarily the the past as in gone, but as in history and your life um, as it was in times where I did not exist, and where a lot of people living today could probably say that they also did not live through. And to understand, um, sort of like what made what was it like to live through times that we've never known, with context that we've never been around, and like the environment that we've never um, fully been within, because things over time change, um, a lot, and you are one of uh, the only people who can that I know who can say that they were that they were there to to see it.
That's a very nice way of saying I'm old, but it's okay. It's the truth.
More like you're wise.
Well, that's lovely of you to say, although in all candor, I've known a lot of people who are old, even older than I am now, who weren't wise. It
It's
doesn't happen automatically,
true.
right? And when I have talked about historical issues with you, I really love some of your insights and your associations with them. So I've got to say, I've known an awful lot of 18-year-olds. I mean, I used to teach them, right? I've known an awful lot of 18-year-olds who don't hold a candle to you in the wisdom department. So it's not 100% age, but certainly I was alive to read the newspapers in the 1960s, and you were not. In fact, you don't read newspapers now because people don't. So there's a change. Yeah.
It's
So you're interested in the difference between people who lived through a time and people who only heard about a time, right? That's what you're suggesting we talk about?
I mean, yeah.
I mean, I'm not the only, I'm not trying to limit you. In fact, I would like to add something to that. Um, and that is how you understand the times you lived through or the times you didn't live through, how that understanding itself may change. Let me give you an example, since I know as a starting point you were concerned with the 1960s versus now in the 2020s. Um, I knew of people, and I've mentioned this to you in the past. I started reading when I was in college, and I was in college starting in 1962. Um, I met people who were concerned about Vietnam. In 62, it wasn't that big a deal nationally. I mean, we began by having about 500 advisors sent in by Eisenhower in 54 after the French lost at Dien Bien Phu, but we didn't think of our involvement in Vietnam as a major thing when we only had, advisors numbering in the hundreds. It's not like what it was in, say, 67 when we had hundreds of thousands and people were being drafted and their lives were being torn up, and there were huge political differences within the country. And sometimes those political differences happen between people my age, college age, and the previous generation, some of whom had, after all, served with great pride in World War II and had thought, if America goes to war, there's a reason for it. We are the good guys, and we are making the world safer by being willing to put our blood and treasure into these efforts on foreign shores. Now, I remember talking to some people, and I would, at this point, I'm already starting to read alternative newspapers, the kinds of things that are published by little presses and I got a friend on campus who has a weekly newspaper sent to him from San Francisco, and here I am in Ithaca, and he passes it on to me, and I'm reading this stuff, and I remember saying, "Well, but what about, to these older people? How come this and how come that?" And again, not always, but often, I would get, "You don't understand. The government th knows things you don't know." So there was a presumption among a fraction of the population, clearly not the whole of it, because there was an anti-war movement that I and my wife, your grandmother, were part of. Um, so it wasn't universal, but there were a lot of people who simply weren't concerned with looking at what we now understand as historical facts, because they were willing to believe that whatever facts there were, they supported the government's viewpoint. So there was a tension in living through that historical moment, not only because of the reality of the war and people dying and people killing and so on, but because there was a fundamental question of trust in institutions that we were having to deal with. And in fact, that is a problem that has never gone away. I think that's the most easily identifiable high point from which trust has continued to erode in one institution after another. Sometimes, in fact, for very good reasons, because the facts come out, or someone claims, no, no, those aren't the facts, these are the facts. So, in a way, just as a taxonomy, there's the time you live and the time you learn about. And then there's what you know and what you know on further investigation. And those two things, the living versus the hearing and the understanding and the re-understanding, those two things really make four different ways of looking at the whole issue. And I think I've been thinking a lot about that lately because of some of the books I've been reading and also because of the political moment we live in. And I'm going back to those alternative newspapers. It turned out that those godless hippies who were producing those rags that people 30 and 40 and 50 years older than I was were willing to dismiss without even considering that they might be telling the truth. Turns out that they were telling the truth. And that makes a big difference to the US involvement in Vietnam. But it also makes an enormous difference to how the US understands what it means to us to have been involved in Vietnam. Being involved in Vietnam was, of course, sending people to kill and die, but it wasn't just that. It it consumed the whole country. I mean, 69 was the moon landing. I mean, if you look back at the 1960s, you can say, oh, it's the era of, NASA as the supreme shining example of American capability and vision. It's also the middle of the Vietnam War, which finally made Americans stop believing the lie. I had heard there was a lie that I heard. I knew it was a lie. I didn't understand why my teachers told it to me from, in middle school. So I was born in 46. So as you know, I didn't go to the eighth grade. So between seventh and ninth grade, which would have made me 11 and 12 years old, right? So this was 57 and 58. My teachers were saying, America has never lost a war. My social studies teachers were saying that. Well, we lost the War of 1812, right? I mean, we were trying to take over Canada, among other things. We lost it. The Korean War had just ended in a stalemate. What does it mean to understand that the young of this country are being raised on a curriculum that has lies in it. And, people just didn't accept it as being having lies in it. Although as a kid, you could read, even in the history books, as whitewashed as they may have been, you could read this and you could, well, that's not true. We didn't not lose. We lost or we didn't win. But after Vietnam, it became impossible for most people to say certain kinds of things. It was so clear that trust had changed. And Vietnam is a tourist location for us now, and it's a site of inexpensive industrial labor because China is getting priced out of the market. That's true even without tariffs, because there are cheaper places in Southeast Asia than there are in East Asia. Um, Vietnam, in that sense, is long behind us. It's not behind it for the Vietnamese, but for Americans, Vietnam as a war is long behind us. But the engagement in the Vietnam War as a force for modifying the relationship between the individual and the nation, and sometimes, as with me talking to someone a generation or two older, what it means to be a part of our family or society. That hasn't gone away. We're still living, in that sense, in a post-Vietnam War era. I mean, we're post other things that happened afterwards, but you focused on the 60s. And yeah, it was uh, it was Grease, and it was hair, and it was rock and roll, and it was the Beatles. I mean, I remember when your Uncle David went off to college, um, he came back from Berkeley, which had been the free speech movement and all of this stuff that he heard about in the 60s and so on. And he came back and he said, "It's not Berkeley. I thought it was going to be Berkeley. It's not Berkeley." I mean, he kind of thought, I can go to the 60s. It was this wonderful, wonderful decade. And I've got to say, it's the decade in which I went to college and had all kinds of interesting things happen and met and married your grandmother, which I'm eternally grateful for. But looking at it historically, it's not just there was the Vietnam War.
No,
There
yeah,
was
there was so much.
what happened to America because it pursued it the way it did.
Yeah, because like yeah, there was the whole like counterculture movement and everything that came out of that, and just all the changes that led from that, like people getting more like progressive or like trying to make changes um, in America and like trying to like speak out more, like compared to like the 50s where I don't know it, at least from what we learn in school, like the 50s compared to the 60s, like the 50s are like the ideal like nuclear family and like housewife and everything is happy, but it's like disillusioned because really there's a lot of things that aren't really fair or like to everyone, and like I don't know, to everyone else, like minorities and just like, and also like policies abroad, but like there was this happy time because of like your World War II is done, and so now like they're free and they won, but then I feel like people start to speak out more about things in the 60s.
Well, the number of people who spoke out audibly, meaning they not only spoke, but other people heard them, certainly increased in the 60s. But I think what you said about minorities, whether you mean racial minorities or economic minorities or even geographic minorities, like the rural versus the urban, um, I think that people were, in fact, speaking out a lot in the 1950s. I think that the revulsion against the McCarthy era, which was after all the
Mm-hmm.
50s, was people saying, hey, wait a minute, we just can't have the government doing stuff like that. It took a while to say it. And Brown versus Board of Education in 1954 was a moment when the rest of America kind of recognized that Black America, or a lot of Black America, had been saying for decades, wait a minute, you guys have got to, this is wrong. It's wrong. So when you say people spoke out more, they did, or more people did. But I think a key point is they spoke out audibly. We were willing to listen. And I think one of the reasons we were willing to listen is because we realized that just relying on what we heard through official channels wasn't good enough.
That makes sense. Yeah, because it's true. Like a lot of people were advocating for things or wanting things before that time. It just only started to get heard maybe or around these times. I mean, obviously, because I guess in history they want to like paint it as like a progression or like a natural like progression of things, but it's like you can have moments where that are reflective of one time versus another based on history, but really it's just like it kind of it's like outliers to the agenda that we're taught, but that's just like that's how it really was. That like I don't know. That's what I just because the way that I learn about like the 20th century is all mostly through like school and the media that I consume. And so, you know, they want to paint things in certain lights to emphasize certain things. Um, but it's like there were other things happening at plenty of different times and different moments that don't follow a certain path or a certain or same type of, you know, like whatever, like same message. I don't know.
Yeah. Let me make a couple of responses, Len. Um, when people change what they think is important to them, they change history. I don't mean they change what happens. I mean, they change, well, that's the history. I mean, like in Spain, where, Grandma and I lived for a year, every single little town has a Plaza de Colón, a Columbus Square. And in pretty much, if they have any money at all, any size town, there'll be a statue of Columbus, and often he will be pointing west. It's just terrific. That ain't true in Latin America. There's nobody there saying, oh, good, we got discovered. Aren't we lucky? It's all different. So in 1984, and I know it doesn't matter how come I happen to remember the date, but in 1984, when finally we understood that there was a virus causing AIDS, and we named it the, human immunodeficiency virus. Before that discovery, there was this strange epidemic that was growing among Haitians and homosexuals. Those were the two communities in which people recognized some of the symptoms that had to do with particular skin cancers. And I mean, it's a horrible, 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 fatal disease. But it was pretty much limited. And I remember a comedian saying, the hardest thing about getting this disease, and you would think the hardest thing about getting this disease is that you're going to die, because that was the case. And then he said, the hardest thing about getting this disease is trying to convince your parents that you're Haitian. I mean, think about what an incredibly homophobic joke that is. It was not important to say to them that you were going to die and you wanted their support. You had to convince them that even though you weren't black, you're really Haitian because God forbid you should let them know that you were gay. I mean, it's a horrible, horrible joke targeting two different groups, both of which are viewed as minorities, and in a sense, attacking both. So much that it doesn't even matter if I'm going to die, just so long as I can keep all of these social stereotypes straight. But after 1984, when we knew there was an actual virus and we understood how it was transmitted, even though the majority of cases still happened among the gay community, people didn't make jokes like that anymore because suddenly they realized people like Ryan White, a completely heterosexual youngster, gets a blood transfusion and gets AIDS and dies of it, right? I mean, they suddenly realized, hey, it's everybody's problem. We can't push it off on other groups. So the change of knowledge, it even changed the humor that we used. And I think that was true of so many things. And it was true of what happened in Vietnam. Things that people were willing to joke about, I was furious about because I was viewing a different set of facts. And when you say people were speaking out more, they were. But maybe they were speaking out more because they were being heard more. And it seemed more like it would be worth something to speak up. Um, which doesn't seem to be the case anymore, right? I mean, we seem to be in a period where instead of the president saying, I'm the president of all the people, even if you don't agree with me, we have someone saying, I'm the president of the people who agree with me, and the rest of you, who cares? So you're not going to be heard if you speak up, and that is an impediment to speaking up. I mean, nobody likes to waste their breath or feel ignored.
It's true. It's a good point.
Yeah. So I don't know to what extent this has to do with the 60s, but I will say that when you see a production of Hair, and I did see it live, and I also have seen the movie, um, and you see those hippies at that crucial moment all disrobe, what they're saying is, okay, this is shocking to you, but it shouldn't be shocking. We're all people, and we need to acknowledge that instead of thinking of the divide between us and them, the bombers and the bombed, um, or those who get conscripted and those who manage to get their way out of it, etc. Um, those were important debates that were happening, and it was not an easy time to have those debates. For example, the civil rights movement, which was strong through the middle of the 60s, became much harder to pursue. It became much more polarized with things like the Black Panthers and so on, who had a lot of trouble dealing with, I don't mean they had the problem, the dominant society had trouble dealing with them. People will always say, I've read it in history books, because they felt their power structure was threatened. And that's certainly true. But I don't think that the threat to the white dominated power structure in 1969 would have been nearly so disabling for the white power structure if the anti-Vietnam War movement weren't simultaneously sapping their sense of authority. So there was a defensiveness in the dominant institutions in this country that a lot of us wanted to fight against. And fortunately, among other things, we were the demographically largest group, right? I mean, I was born in March of 46. So I'm not, I guess technically I'm a baby boomer. I mean, the war came, it ended, and 9 months later, there I am.
Yeah.
So, you know, uh, anyway, this, this is deal with I hope, the kinds of questions you had in mind when you
Yeah.
suggested we talk about the 60s.
Yeah. The 60s was just like a starting point because I mean, I'm happy to talk about just like everything that like went on, like I think um I really like hearing like the comparisons from like different times, just like because I think to me what's interesting is just like the general like feeling, like how you were feeling, how other people were feeling about certain things about life, about political issues or societal, social, economic issues, just like what the consensus was. Because, you know, I feel like, if you take someone from who was born, or no, if you take someone who was an adult when you were born and you brought them here to talk to people, I feel like they would probably feel very differently about a lot of things. But
Yeah.
maybe
N-
maybe
n-
they wouldn't.
could you name one or two so I can know what's prominent in your own mind?
I mean, things like, you know, the expansion of technology, things like, like consensus or like feelings about the government, feelings about um, their economic status, or feelings about others' uh, class, and like others maybe like what did they what did they feel within their own life that is different from how if they were trying to live their life here. It would be like things like, I don't know, even things like going out, like going to a restaurant or watching a movie, because that would be different too. Or like feelings about other types of people, feelings about different ethnicities, feelings about different religions, things about different political positions, demographics. Like what do those people, different people, or like someone similar to you, but but I guess everyone's different, so I don't know. I think everybody would be thinking a different thing, but I feel like there are some things that are more widely accepted at certain points that aren't at other points.
Yeah. Um,
Like if you took someone from the 1700s, they'd be like, "Oh, slavery. I mean, it's complicated. It's nuanced." But then now you would say no, like no slavery, not at all. And
so I'm listening to you, and when you said take someone from the 1700s, I gotta say, Len, you didn't mean take a slave from the 1700s,
no, no,
right? So, I mean, I can't believe that in 1619, when the first slave ship presumably arrived on the North American mainland, I can't believe the people who were kidnapped in West Africa and brought over here were thinking it's nuanced.
exactly. They weren't thinking that.
Exactly. So when we say if you took someone from,
Hmm.
it's real important to think who is
Who?
that someone and why do they think what they think?
Yeah.
So, for instance, I grew up in New York, and I grew up at a time when um, Jews were very common in New York. We were probably the largest single religious denomination in the city. I mean, there were more Christians than Jews, but there were Catholics and there were different varieties of Protestants. Maybe not, but I mean, plenty of Jews around. There was not a problem, and there was nothing about life in New York that was particularly anti-Semitic. I mean, but I knew about anti-Semitism because I had relatives who had felt it growing up in New York, and of course, as soon as I was old enough to learn about the war, meaning World War II, I realized how fatal anti-Semitism is. And as I studied, but as far as I was concerned, I was in a wonderful place. And New York was open, it was accepting. I didn't have to worry about prejudice at all. When I had my high school reunion 30 years after, about 30 years after I graduated, I suddenly realized when I looked at the faces around me that in my class of 648, there were like five blacks. Whereas the population of the city of New York at that time, which was about 8 million or a little more, was about 15% black, maybe 20% black. So we had like less than 1% of our students. And that's in part because I went to a specialized high school where you had to take a test to get in and so on. And, it became clear to me even then as a student, some people didn't have the chance of going to good neighborhood schools, et cetera. Um, but when I look back on it years later, I thought, what kind of education system was there? What kind of a housing system was there? So that this huge fraction of our population, also a minority, also with prejudice against them historically in this country, how come my group got to be able to do so much and their group wasn't able to do much at all, at least not in that public way? And and I've got to say, not only did I note the disparity, but it was easy for me to think there should have been more blacks in that school. We should have had programs that made it easier for the poor to succeed. It was easy for me to do because I was part of the majority culture. So, if around the edges we want to create opportunity for 10% of the people, that's terrific. But along comes feminism, also in the 1960s. Betty Friedan publishes The Feminine Mystique in 1964, and everybody is going, oh my God, people didn't even know what to call what they were feeling. And it's one thing to say, let's have affirmative action for Black people who are 12% of the population at that time nationally, but to say, let's have affirmative action for women who are 51% of the population. Well, wait a minute now. I mean, it's one thing to just sort of, you know, take a little bit of the surplus and make sure it all goes to the right people. Surplus won't do the trick when you're talking about half the population. Now we have to actually face what we mean about having a fair culture, about actually valuing diversity, and so on. And, you know, the 60s gave us the civil rights movement. I think a lot of wonderful things happened because of that. The civil 60s gave us some terrific music. I think a lot of wonderful things happened because of that. Um, the 60s gave us skepticism about authority. And I think that's terrific. But the 60s also invited us to make promises which, in a different context, we are unwilling to keep. And to have to recognize that I thought I was the good guy, but God damn it, I'm not willing to be the good guy. That's really tough. I mean, I grew up where people said, don't worry about money, you'll make enough. And I did. I mean, I was an English professor. I could have been a corporate lawyer. Same skills, right? Reading, writing, parsing nuance. As a corporate lawyer, I would have earned 5, 10, 15 times as much money. But it was okay. I made enough, and I thought it was a good profession. It was socially useful, and I enjoyed it. Great. I think most people going to high school and college now, they don't say, don't worry about money, you'll have enough, right? Because the surplus around the edges is no longer adequate to deal with the need that we obviously have. So I think the 60s, I don't know what it looks like to you, but I'll shut up in a minute and ask. But I know to me, the 60s look like a time when we did our best to understand underlying reality and build something better on that reality, believing that we could. And now I believe it's possible, but that doesn't mean we can do it because we're not organized to do it.
Mm.
I hope
Yeah.
that's not too dark.
No, I mean it's a good point. I mean it's like, you know, you can make promises about things that you want to happen or that you wish could happen, but then to actually put plans in action and actually have things the way that makes things easier for everyone instead of just a small percentage of people, that would require like, getting rid of some of those people's full authority and full power. You have to like spread it out. And so that's like no one wants to give up their supposed advantage or their like privilege to have everyone to give everyone else a chance. So I think, you know, it sounds nice in theory, but when you're in a position to be that you can so easily just be like, no, then you can say things and you can say things, but you don't necessarily have to. There's no one. It's hard for people to actually hold those accountable to make any change or do anything. I feel like.
I think you're right. And I think one of the reasons that that's so is that we are not fundamentally um, set up in this country to honor the individual. And that sounds a little strange, but let me pursue this. America loves to talk about individualism and rugged individualism and the importance of the individual. So much so that if you fail to make it in America, the presumption is it's your fault. It's not that you grew up in a poor neighborhood or with the wrong connections, or anybody could make it. Look at Abraham Lincoln, born in a log cabin. Well, in fact, not entirely true, but it makes a great story. Um, yeah, but he's one person. When you say anyone can grow up to be president, you've got to be an idiot to believe it, since absolutely no woman has ever grown up to be president. But it's only been 250 years. So, you know, we have to ask, what do we really mean by the individual? We don't have, I think, real, we don't honor individuals. If someone speaks out, it's easy to say, you're saying you want justice. It's your fault that you need this. Someone speaks out, it's easy to say, as I was told during the Vietnam War, you don't understand. The government knows things that nobody knows. We don't actually honor the individual. And I think that honoring the individual is in part what the labor union movement was about. Okay, they won't listen to us individually. Well, we care about each other. Let's get together and figure out a way to merge our voices. Um, because we don't honor the individual, when something goes wrong, we incarcerate them. Now, I'm sure you're aware that we incarcerate more than any other event, right, by far. But I was reading some statistics the other day about the rate of the police deaths. Um, I don't know how old this statistic is, but the United States by far has the highest rate of death. We kill annually 39.3, whatever year this thing was taken, but it's a book post 2000. Yeah, 39.3 people per 10 million get killed in the United States every year by police. And all of the other countries go lower and lower than that. All of the industrialized countries go lower and lower. At the bottom of which we have Norway, which kills, you ready for this? Zero.
That is, wow.
And that's a culture in which most of the prisons, and they believe in prisons,
They're really nice prisons.
exactly because the fact that you have got to be removed from society because of your behavior doesn't mean you're not still a person that the society owes something to. And I think a lot of the problems with the 60s, as we look back on them now, is that we thought that we were finding our voices as individuals, that we mattered. But in fact, the system still did not and still does not honor individuals. It only honors typically power. And when that power threatens the larger power structure, things change in ways that actually diminish the individual, except, of course, the individual's responsibility for anything that's wrong in his or her life. So it's not an accident that the 50s were the high point of union membership, as unions got to be less and less powerful. It's not it's not an accident. It's not just the fault of the current administration. It's not an accident that the 1960s were the high point of access to the vote. Every one of these things has, I think, been hemmed in and somewhat diminished. And I would put them all into this one large category. What about individuals? So, not meaning to be critical of you, but when one says it's only you have to, it's the easy way to say it. What would someone from the 60s say if he were around or she were around now in the 2020s? The first thing you have to ask is which someone? Which someone? I knew a woman who loved historical novels, just loved them, and they can be terrific. And I remember one time this woman saying about a particular novel, I just love, this medieval princess. I can really identify. And I said, well, that's great. But if you really like the 1400s, did you ever consider that if you lived there, you might be the scullery maid?
Yeah.
And the answer was, hey, it's my fantasy. And she was right. But if we view not the past, but the future, we make believe that it's the reality we're planning for. And we don't see that often what it is a fantasy we wish would happen, but we're not willing to actually take the actions to make it happen. Um, and sometimes, of course, you feel you can't. I mean, you cast your vote and the other guy wins. I mean, you do what you can do and you can't do everything. So the 60s, even in the 60s did not feel hopeful to me the way your uncle felt. Oh, but I could have gone to Berkeley then. Well, no, there was no Berkeley then either, right? The free speech movement was about protest and so on. I'm not meaning to put down your uncle when he was a young man. He was seeing the wonder of people getting together and speaking out, which was so important. But even at the time, their voices were being trammeled. So the 60s are a complicated lesson to learn, I think. And that's how it looks to me, having lived through them, but you didn't. So now what do you think?
I mean, I think it's good to sort of, yeah, understand like the fantasy versus the reality, the what do you wish could happen and what actually happened or what didn't happen. I think um, it's important that people were were potentially, they were being hurt a little bit more, but there was still, it's still like there's doesn't mean that it was a time full of like hope and change for every moment or everybody necessarily. I
So
think
you're young. Can you make this decade better?
this decade,
Well, I'm 80 years old. I'm not going to go out and man the barricades. My bones are too frail. But you're not. Are you going to do something? I don't, and that's not a challenge. I'm asking. What do you foresee for yourself? Do you foresee, looking around and doing the best you can, floating on the current of history? Or do you foresee finding a paddle and moving the boat one way or the other?
Hmm, that's hard. I think I think at this stage in my life, I can kind of I can foresee myself doing a lot of things, but then again, about what we've been saying, it's easier to think or to like wish about certain things than to actually do things, um, and like make change. It's easier to say that you want that, than actually put it into action, because sometimes, you know, the system doesn't work out that way. It wasn't meant for you to. It wasn't meant to be changed. It feels like it feels like we'll say like in America, it's like the system is set up like not to change. I feel like it's set up for people in power to become more powerful and people not in power to stay there or even get less powerful for certain people. Um, but I think, and it's like, our laws are the Constitution and the amendments, but we barely ever make an amendment. It's like it feels like America, or at least it feels like the society that I live in, or perhaps the one that you live in, or lived in, or live in. It feels like it wasn't really meant for things to be changed, even though they need to. Like we need to have amendments, and a lot of the new amendments, like they're really important. That it's like it wasn't built for that. It seems like.
Yeah, they clearly the framers made it hard. And I think one of the reasons they made it hard is the same reason that they didn't outlaw slavery. In order to be able to come up with a document that all the colonies would sign on to, they had to make it obvious to the slaveholder, those who were from a slaveholding economy, that they weren't liable to get outnumbered and lose. The immigrants were coming in the North, not the South. And if you just use proportional representation, the House of Representatives would eventually have enough clout to get rid of slavery, as Massachusetts was already doing. Um, but if every state has its own two senators and we have an electoral college, it's just really hard to change the fundamental institutions. I think that one of the reasons that it's hard, and we're often told as school kids, we made the Constitution hard to amend so that we would not do it lightly. But I think one of the reasons we made the Constitution hard to amend is the same reason we have an electoral college. We wanted to make sure that we could get those slaveholders to be willing to sign on. And when we talk about a more perfect union, we don't mean that the country we have will be more perfect. We mean that we are more likely to function as a union rather than fragmented into people with different viewpoints. So I guess what I'm saying is, A, I agree with you, but B, I think that it is understandable in broader terms that come out of history and speak to the current moment about the condition of, say, blacks in this country today. Um, so when you say you want to change things, but it's not set up to change, sadly, I think you're right. But the fact that it's not set up for that doesn't mean that we can't try.
It's true.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much for letting me bend your ear for a while, Len. It's always a pleasure every time we have a conversation. You're terrific.
You
Thank you.
are too.
Thank you. I love you.
I love you.
Bye bye.
Bye.